Hello, this is Jeffrey Tucker, Brownstone Institute. I'm very pleased today to welcome Walter Kirn on the show, who's just, as far as I'm concerned, a national treasure of great literary enterprise, a film writer, scriptwriter, novelist. I'll just say it frankly without sounding overly flattering. I think he's a genius. Before we introduce him, though, I just want to kind of talk a little bit about the template of our discussion concerning the media and its role in the shaping of the public mind and its relationship to, let's just say, the priorities of our public managers. It was never obvious to me that there was this strange symbiotic cartel at work until the COVID period, when it just became preposterous. Suddenly, all our public officials were announcing preposterous things. Douse yourself with hand sanitizer, dive underneath the sofa, whatever you do, don't celebrate religious holidays, and strap a cloth on 2-year-old kids. It was so outrageous and so preposterous. And yet, day after day after day, you couldn't find anybody in the entirety of the mainstream media to dispute it or even question it. Oh, yes, this is what the experts are saying. Here's another expert. Wait, I just saw that same expert 2 hours ago. How come this expert is spending all of his time, with the national media instead of actually reading journals? It was clearly some kind of conspiracy. Now, for me personally, this came as a shock, because I'll just tell you that my relationship to the media has traditionally been, okay, they're biased in a certain way, but they're well-intended. They have a public interest at heart, ultimately. They do want to be the chronicler of our national lives, so I might kind of disagree with the New York Times, but they're professionals. They know what they're doing. Now, of course, you could say to me, and you probably are, what's wrong with you, Tucker? They've been doing this since at least 9/11, if not decades earlier. Yeah, sure, but the 9/11 bit, when suddenly the entire media was whipping it up for war with Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. Yeah, that maybe could seem to be a little bit forgivable. Here's the thing. I thought the media was just reflecting conventional wisdom. It never occurred to me that actually the media is creating the conventional wisdom. That was something that was lost on me. So yeah, I fell out of love with the New York Times during the COVID period, as far as I'm concerned. They started the whole thing on February 27th, 2020 with the podcast with the disease hysteric Donald G. McNeil, who they later threw under the bus and fired the poor guy. Anyway, to help make sense of something of this media landscape of this period and the current one, let's introduce Walter. Walter, it's wonderful, wonderful, wonderful to have you here. Thank you.
It's great to be here. I wish I had as sophisticated and Bloomsburian a background as you do. I'm here in Montana in the cabin, and you're apparently at Virginia Woolf's house. And,
yeah, I had to send the footman away. I don't know if you can you see the candle that I lit in the shot? Do you see the little candle by the statue? Is that visible to you?
I can feel them as ambiance, but I can't see them as individual items.
I really wondered if the candle was over the top, but anyway, the wallpaper. The wallpaper is I'm proud of the wallpaper. It's you called it Bloomsburian. I think it's just sort of Brownstonian myself.
Oh, okay. Well, I was trying. I know that you're writing a book on home decor.
I am.
And my knowledge of that subject is limited to going to Edith Wharton's house once, the museum that they made of it, with a girlfriend, and growing up around my mother, I suppose. But you can tell from my background that it's not a particular interest of mine.
Now, we will get to the subject at hand, but I am so intrigued. What was your impression of Edith Wharton? I found that house to be a little puritanical and a little stodgy and a little bit reactionary in the sense that she was in full revolt against the garishness of the Newport mansions.
Well, you see, Jeffrey, you have such sensitive and knowledgeable ideas about decor that you were able to have those reactions. Mine was, It's kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and I wonder if it's haunted. It was better than any house I'd lived in, and so I was impressed. But in any case,
you can imagine with this, like she built in at the 1880s, and it has no columns, right? No columns. And you get the sense that if you walked up to her and said, "Hey, where are your columns?" she would say, "Oh no, I don't put columns on my house."
The Diana Vreeland of her day, only with architecture. All I can say is that when I went to Mark Twain's house in Hartford, and that was because of you, because you went out and got a ticket. See, if things involve getting a ticket first, I often don't do them for my whole life, even though I know I will be well rewarded if I do. And that was a house lived in and with personality, and that had a biography to every room, and a feeling that it was haunted in such a good way that its resident had put himself into it and then left his body with the house as supplanting it. And so I've started to get into the subject, but I've got a long way to go.
Do you recall that house has the shape of a steamship? Do you remember that?
It did. It did have the shape of a steamship. And to me, making a house look like an object that you really loved from your youth is the kind of naive thing that you're allowed to do when you finally break through and get a little money. I was just strangely at Scott Adams' house, the late Scott Adams. I was there for his memorial, and it was out in California in a very bucolic suburb of San Francisco. Anyway, the house was made to look like the Dilbert comic character. It had eyes like that. And it reminded me of Mark Twain. I said, Twain did that too. He made his house a simulation of
the thing he loves.
The thing he loved. And I was charmed by it.
Yeah, it's very charming. Did you catch that house was nearly torn down after he died because Mark Twain had basically lost his reputation as an interpreter of national life, and I gather that's because of his response to the Spanish-American War.
Interesting. Well, I mean, there's a path to our subject there, because Twain was in some sense the media of his day for a long time. He was a magazine editor. He was a after dinner speaker. He was the world's most famous American. He was someone whose pronouncements and whose little paragraph length intros and comments were sought after. But he got crosswise with the imperial project at some point, and with its pretensions and with its cruelties. And when he did, it was able, by then, the media that was not just him anymore, or, to turn on him, to bite the hand that had, in some sense, fed it or helped nourish its creation. And you're right that Mark Twain should be disgraced is like Walter Cronkite living to have CBS News turn on him.
Suddenly Jay Bhattacharya comes to mind, right? A beloved, a major figure, a Stanford professor, or Martin Kulldorff, right? And suddenly they were called fringe figures because there was another national priority that these two guys said, look, we're not going to go along with this. So suddenly they're declared fringe and outside the mainstream.
And you just noted that there was a New York Times writer who you said the Times threw under the bus after his COVID input was, I don't know, superseded, no longer needed, and maybe not intense enough. I'm not sure.
That was Donald G. McNeil, and very interesting. Very interesting. I've always wanted to meet him. Actually, his book on the history of pandemics is pretty interesting. Yes, he's a germaphobe. Yes, he's a hysteric. Yes, he's been waiting for disease X all his life, and he thought this was his main chance. But I do think it came from a sincere place, but at some point, boy, they threw him out. And do you recall why?
No,
Okay.
I don't.
Yeah. Well, I'll talk about it some other time, but it's the most incredible thing. It's from a passing comment he had made six years earlier that suddenly became the thing that everybody is supposed to talk about and hate on. It's so strange, these.
Well, so during this small talk, which I've used strategically to form thoughts and reactions about your monologue or your intro, I've been waiting to tell a story. I used to think as you did. When I entered the media, my first job was writing headlines for the Vanity Fair magazine that Tina Brown created in the mid-'80s as a kind of Anglophile social bridge between the London and Eurotrash elite and New York and Los Angeles and Hollywood and so on. And so I get to Vanity Fair and I see all these characters. I mean, polo players from South America with a guy they kept calling, I think it was Gordon. And then I found out it was Sting, but they used his actual name. And then and there would be, Mick Jagger and then some British aristocrat and whoever. And I started to see that the media was a front. It wasn't exactly the Epstein network, but it was something that I think the Epstein network was trying to approximate or maybe, intervene on. And it was not the establishment either, but it was the beau monde plus the establishment plus the commercial interests that advertise. And so I started to realize that we represented an interest group, a very strange interest group. And we weren't representing our readers and their curiosity and, we weren't responding to them. We were, as you say, creating conventional wisdom. And we were creating it about a group that kind of had a lot of secrets and a lot of blemishes and a lot of weaknesses. But in the age of Ralph Lauren polo, wanted to be seen as a kind of, fluid, glossy, international, transatlantic elite that all of America should be enchanted by. So then I went to Time magazine and I thought, well, enough of that unserious society page BS. I'll be at Time magazine. Now we'll get down to the nitty gritty. And after I'd been there for a little while, I remember turning to, and I'm not sure who it was exactly, one of the high editors and saying, why is it that we have the same cover almost half the time as Newsweek? And I'm not talking about when there's a story that naturally would be on the cover of both of our magazines, but
the Titanic going under or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
But an odd, story, a tertiary or secondary story, and it's the same as Newsweek. And I said, aren't we competitors? And the person practically laughed. They sort of laughed in that way that is supposed to show you that you're a little naive, but that they're not going to answer your question candidly, like that. And so I started then to realize that the great Luce, Henry Luce institution, Time magazine, which had been pretty frank back in the day about, its anti-communism and its patriotism and its other things, was literally still that loose publication in some way. And so was Newsweek. And, we often hear that phrase, the illusion of choice. You have a choice of two flavors of the same thing, It's ice cream, but there's vanilla and French vanilla, which I've never figured out the distinction between, except that one is a little yellower than the other. Would you like vanilla or French vanilla? So I then, as I progressed, and now we're in the 1990s, okay? Then as I progressed, I worked for a series of places. The New Republic, I remember. And the New Republic around the early 2000 teens seemed to exist to promote Obamacare, to get the bill passed, literally, and to tell us how glorious the future would be if it were passed. And Obamacare was also being promoted everywhere else. I mean, generalized, socialized, or whatever healthcare was thought to be a great goal of the American evolution into a sophisticated, truly modern place. And it was at that point, and then when Obamacare came in, and I personally got it because I was a freelance writer and saw how awful it was and how expensive it was and how it had completely betrayed every single promise that we at the New Republic had made, that I started to get a little, well, like Twain got about the Spanish-American War, but at a much more, secular and small scale level. Though maybe not. I mean, it was a turn in American social history and political history that I don't think we quite appreciate the importance of. The entirety of what I'm saying is that you're absolutely right. It does form public opinion. And it does not represent the diversity of thought that you'd think it would. In fact, it would not do that almost as a program because that would cause confusion in what these people at the big level of the high media, the thing that came out of Paley's CBS and, Walter Lippmann in the 1920s and his New Republic and so on. It had been established, the more I read about it and the more I researched the industry that I was actually in, to lead America around like a show dog is led on a leash. Look, it jumps up, and, I can make it jump up on a stand, and then I can make it, mince along, and I can make it sit, and I can make it run. And that was what the media was for.
Amazing. I've never read this Lippmann book. You mentioned it the other day.
Public Opinion, I think it's called.
Yeah, I've read his book called, I think it's called The Good Society, I think it's called. Mm-hmm. And it's a strange book because the first half of the book is wonderful. And then it just kind of falls apart. First half of the book is all about freedom and civil rights and freedom of speech and constitutional government, and all these things, and you're just nodding along. The second half is about how a select group of managerial elites actually ought to be running everything.
Right. Yes, that was the time when they were frank and optimistic about what we've come to call the deep state or the elite or whatever. Yeah. And it's not only its right to run things, which was presumed because it was them. Everyone who is themselves feels they have the right through natural human egotism. But they not only felt they had the right, they felt that they had the duty. And the duty was to take this kind of unwashed nation that had recently been, a bunch of farmers who had never read anything but the Bible and maybe had never even read it, but heard it spoken, and mold it into a force that could accomplish ends that the American people really didn't understand, ends that had been largely articulated, I think, in England and places like that. Progressive ends, progressivism, let's move and shape and sort of mold and masonically carve this people into something that they believed was scientifically, socially, and intellectually better. And so that's what they do. And after I had my kind of awakening about what they do and how they do it, I thought, well, but doesn't it stand to reason that if you have power, you use it? You don't just use the front page of the New York Times, that incredibly important real estate, that incredibly expensive real estate, to react to what's going on. Mm-hmm. You use it to drive your nation. In the case of the New York Times, not just yours. your ally, your alliance, your family across Europe and wherever. And so, it's practically the State Department, the New York Times, and that's how they see themselves. And so,
well, sometimes it gets it's preposterous. Let me ask you that. I think I'm remembering this right. There was a period, and I think it was sometime in 2020 when the cover of the New York Times every day would be something like, "How many people died yesterday?"
Right, like a kind of medical weather report about the health of the U.S.
It was strange. Let's just say they said 2,163 people died yesterday. Okay, right. That's tremendously alarming. Just like, holy crap! But then you think, wait, how many people usually die every day? I actually don't know. I don't know.
Good question.
Is that too few, too many? I mean, like, what's going on here? But it became this news, and everywhere you went, people would scream at you, "Don't you realize that 2,163 people died yesterday?" And in my entire life, I can't remember anybody, the man on the street, knowing how many people died yesterday. Like, that's never been the source of news.
Well, and in the case of the COVID period and the quote unquote pandemic, which will always be the quote unquote pandemic in my mind, because there are so many aspects of it that seem to have been contrived. We were treated to a lot of numbers. We were treated to numbers constantly. Cases. I remember when the deadliness or the fatality reading on the thing was how, it'd go between 0.08 and like 2. And I was like, which is it? 2 out of 100 and 0.08 are really different. That's the difference between, if I go to the supermarket 20 times, I'm going to die, or I have a half chance of dying. And, me just breezing along, knowing a piano won't fall on my head, walking right under buildings. And so I really need...
Walter, there was, speaking of that, so Fauci is testifying before the Senate very early on. This is like mid-February 2020. And he says, we're not quite sure what the case fatality rate is. And there's like 100 people sitting there because suddenly all these senators actually care about him. We're not really quite sure what the case fatality rate is, but we think it may have a death rate of 3 or 4%. So there's 100 people sitting in the room, and you can just tell in the entire room, everybody thought, 3 of us.
Which one of us is it? It's like the beginning of an Agatha Christie novel. There are 200 people in this room, and the fatality rate is 4%. And it is a galloping pandemic, which is, affecting and infecting more people every moment. And then all of a sudden, someone goes, and that's how COVID started in the media. When you reverse engineer the COVID period in terms of media behavior, as we're doing a little bit here, you get a case study in engineered hysteria that I don't think you can get from any other set of events, and when it was early on when they started having the major celebrities come down with COVID almost simultaneously, and then not only come down with it, but be very open on their live streams from their phones about how bad they felt and how they were in their homes, in Bel Air, quarantined from the world. And Tom Hanks over in Australia. I mean, they got a twofer there. They scared Australia and America at the same time, and I remember thinking, like, as a veteran of the media, this is crazy. All the famous people are getting sick at the same time, but they're all okay, even though the rest of us might not be. Ellen's okay, Madonna's okay, David Spade or whoever it is okay, Tom Hanks is okay. We're still supposed to be worried a little about them, but we're supposed to be really worried about ourselves. And this is preposterous. is anybody buying this? And I looked around, and, it was like that first act in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where you're not sure that your friends are turning into zombies, but it kind of feels like it. And I was like, yeah, they are buying it. They're buying it because we have run on them since, I don't know, the Spanish-American War, maybe. That's a good place to start. And the William Hearst papers and the Citizen Kane-like promotion of that war in the Hearst papers. We have run an operation of mass conditioning. And through the century, we've learned all kinds of things from like Freud and Jung and Lippmann and others, about how exactly to do this in a technical sense. And we've gotten so damn good at it that there's probably a word that every one of these celebrities is using casually. I mean, this is how paranoid you get. Just like cops are more afraid of crime than normal people because they see it so much. As a journalist, you get more afraid of lying if you start getting honest with yourself than the normal person. And you become actually more paranoid than maybe you even should be. But I've started thinking, what are they doing to produce this result? What black magic that I never was made privy to because, I was Jimmy Stewart in a way. I don't want to make myself out to be any kind of hero, but I was Jimmy Stewart. Like, early on in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, when all the papers turn against him suddenly, and he can't figure out why because they selectively quote something he said. I mean, we've known this as Americans for a long time, but so why didn't that movie, and why didn't, Mark Twain, the skeptic, saying, if you've read anything about in the papers that you happen to know about, that the papers are lying all the time? Or why didn't Murray Gell-Mann, the erstwhile Epstein friend who also invented the quark, but who had this brilliant observation, and they call it Gell-Mann amnesia. He said, if you've seen them lie about one thing, why do you trust them the next time? But we do, because either we don't know what else to do, or the social instincts have been hijacked by, social psychiatrists who worked in laboratories and, consulted, or it's just that secretly we're afraid because we don't know where we'll go, who our friends will be, and what our spouse will think if we
disagree.
Opt out.
If we dissent, and if you dissent, there is danger for you. So you're better off, even if you don't believe it, in spouting the line. I think at some point this became clear during the COVID period that it was just like this weird tribal response that was, and the liturgy was being dictated by the mass media on what kind of absurd thing they were going to demand of you next.
Well, and they were also, you see, it's a two-pronged operation. It involves, convincing you of things using, assertions, but it also involves public punishment. And on the late night shows, the Colbert Show and the Kimmel Show and so on, the licensed mockery of those who didn't go along was nightly and actually brutal. And, so during the day, you'd see them scaring you about case numbers and the CNN case count going along like the Dow Jones at the bottom of the screen or in the corner. I knew the news was BS when they started adding all those numbers around the screen. Just tell me the truth. Don't fill the thing with numbers. They say that numbers don't lie, but it is my belief that it is chiefly numbers that lie.
Yeah.
Don't you lie about the price of everything when you come home to your spouse with a new sweater? Don't you, whether it's the tax man or whatever, numbers are the way we lie. Our height, our weight. And so when they started putting numbers on TV, I was like, wow, they've moved into the hyperspace, the hyperdimensional lying here, where there's lies going on all around the screen while the one in the middle of the screen is happening. So, yes, when people say, why are you stuck on this COVID thing? And that's all over. I have two responses. One, why are you stuck on the classics when there are new books being published? Because they're where you learn. There are the studies and the examples and the fables and the archetypes that will educate you in the future. And then my number two thing about why are you stuck on COVID is because people are still getting it, man. They just stopped, they made a big deal of it once, but they stopped making a big deal of it. And your body is still manufacturing spike proteins, by the way. So it's as current as this very moment.
They're desperate to move on in part because the great inoculation failed, which is, one of the great medical failures of modern times, I think.
Well, when Fauci got COVID, I was just, are they really going to keep doing this? But anyway, the media is interesting because we all know the game. And those who don't, I have a hard time believe aren't being willfully obtuse on the one hand, or else willfully submissive. And, they might, for their own private consumption, be saying that they're skeptical, but they're playing along because they think they have a stake in it. They think that American society needs this game to be played. It needs this consensus, quote unquote, because that became a big word. When Americans started worrying about consensus, I knew it wasn't the America that I had grown up in or been taught to revere anymore. When it was numbers of people who had signed a letter, not the quality of the person who had signed the letter. When it was, cases, not anything real, like who died, then I was worried. And I think that the cultural change and has been, in some ways catastrophic, and it was the media that did it. None of the things that happened could have happened without them, and they knew it, and they were the vector. They were the vector of infection.
I'm curious about this because do you know this guy Michael Barbaro? He runs the New York Times Daily podcast, and it's like a very nice guy,
No, because like cops who don't go into a certain neighborhood anymore because, they used to patrol there. I barely read the New York Times.
Okay. Well, I wish I could have just a frank discussion with him. We used to be on texting terms, but that stopped. But on February 27th, 2020, this is 2 days after the World Health Organization told the entire planet to lock down just like China. Mm-hmm. But South by Southwest had not yet been canceled.
Right.
We were still in the early stages of hysteria. Trump was still tweeting out, we're going to get through this. This is just a fluke. Okay. They started that podcast on February 27th with Donald G. McNeil coming in, spraying the place with a bottle of hydrogen peroxide. Okay. And they talked about it on air. Well, what are you doing? What are you spraying? Well, this is hydrogen peroxide. It kills germs. And if I'm going to sit down here with you, I want to make sure this is a germ-free environment because this is going to be a plague like we've never seen. This is going to make 1918 look like a mere warm-up. So they had this kind of, and the thing lasted 30 minutes, but it was it was a brilliant presentation because they're warming up the public to be hysterical. Now, Walter,
but here is a measure of how fickle they can be. That hydrogen peroxide, which served as a prop to make you feel it was all very serious, later became bleach. Donald Trump thinks you should inject bleach. Wait, bleach is hydrogen peroxide. That's what I do to get surfaces clean. But Trump likes it now, so it's bleach.
Yeah, that's right. But it was the strangest thing because I went back and looked at 1968-69 flu pandemic and 57-58 pandemic and looked what the New York Times said and what they always said. And this goes back all the way even to polio, even to the 1929, parrot flu of 1929. They always had the same advice, which was calm down. If you get sick, just see your doctor. Our medical professionals know how to deal with these kind of infections. Everything's going to be okay. This is what the New York Times had said for a century. And suddenly on this one day, February 27th, they flipped it and tried to drive public mania. They were the source of it. Now, I'm so interested. This is why I would love
that is the mode by which wars are promoted usually, not the mode by which public health crises are soothed and tamped down. Why did they turn it into the equivalent of going to war? And a scary war at that. One that you probably couldn't win, so stay home while the experts do it.
Yeah, I turned off the New York Times podcast that day, but I think I knew that was the day I knew that something was going haywire. That's when I knew that the lights were going out on civilization at that moment. You had an interesting analysis. I don't know if maybe you don't want to present it here because I thought it was.
I'll say anything I've said to you.
Okay, it was about which it taps into a deep, like cultural memory of the plague ships of the Middle Ages.
Yes,
that the ship, the trading port would arrive, at the harbor, and there was, but it was a plague ship right?
on board.
Yeah, rats on board.
Or plague. I mean, it was even before I think they quite knew that rats were the cause, but the ship had the plague on it, and that is how COVID started. They used the plague ship script. Whatever it was called, the Diamond Princess, or whatever that thing that was steaming toward L.A. I remembered how Trump didn't want to let people disembark, or he wanted to turn it around or something. But that was still at the point where, weirdly, they wanted COVID to be kind of, a small concern right before they turned, and they wanted it to be the reason we couldn't go to church or operate our businesses anymore. The question is not whether it's orchestrated but why is it orchestrated in the particular ways it is, and who leads the orchestra? That's the question. And I can tell you that having not risen through the ranks due to my obvious attitude adjustment needs, I can't tell you quite who runs it or where the memos come from or at what time they arrive. We should ask Ezra Klein, but because he does know. Journalist, was that early revelation about various journalists who were sort of trading messages early in the day so that they could get their message, get their opinions straight. Well, wherever it comes from, it seems to be not industry, not quite industry, not quite academia, but something like the military-industrial complex,
and not quite the civilian administrative state, right? So it's not like the Department of Labor,
right?
Calls up the New York Times. I mean, maybe they do on particular matters of like what the unemployment rate is or something like that, but it's not like they're taking orders from Department of Education or the FTC or something like that. So it's more substantial than that. It's more more insidious.
Yeah, and it seems, as I say, having been a reporter and a journalist and a hanger about for so long, that the way that this ship moves and the precision with which it executes its pivots they reek of military command, frankly. They reek of the kind of instructions that armies get. Go to the river, stop, move back, advance, disperse, etc. And I can't imagine that there is any other way that you could, and any other modality through which you could get this apparently vast army of supposed individuals and free thinkers, because aren't journalists supposed to be the most skeptical among us, the most cussed, the most individualistic? They may start that way. I did.
I think you know this, but the Great Barrington Declaration started not as some sort of, open letter of protest to the world or whatever. It started as simply a teaching seminar for journalists. This was the idea.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, the journal. So
how naive! How wonderful!
I know, but
how optimistic! How American! How poignant!
I know. But,
yep.
But Walter, everything was so crazy. Like they were saying insane things. Like you mentioned cases, the case study. Okay, they weren't reporting cases; they're reporting infections. Okay, so for like a century, we've clearly, had this clear binary demarcation between infections on the one hand, which are like, oh, you're infected, okay, or you've been exposed. And cases on the other would send you to the hospital, and now you're, fighting for your life, right? This is like a case versus an infection. But during the COVID period, they smashed them all together, contradicting 100 years of practice, knowledge, and data. So we're already destroying all the data. We don't even know who's actually sick or who's actually getting the small degree of infection to train the immune system. So it was nuts. So Martin said, look, the problem is, Martin Kulldorff said to me, he said, the problem is, I don't think these reporters are well trained on simple basics of public health and virology. So they need to learn. I thought, that's right. That is right. Let's bring them in. And given your status, they will clearly want to show up to a seminar where you teach them how to think about these matters, right? It seemed to be very apparent. So that's what it was supposed to be. So he said, okay, great. I'll show up. You handle logistics, including contacting the media. Well, I wrote every report of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, all the big venues. I wrote everybody I could who was writing about that and invited them. I said, great news. You can come to a seminar to actually learn about the subject on which you're reporting. This is going to be a fantastic day for you. And then I theorized that all the media would change. They'd say, oh, we got some things wrong in the past. It turns out there's a difference between cases and infections. There is such a thing as natural immunity. This is a respiratory virus that's quickly mutating and not likely to be something against which we can vaccinate. They would say these things, right? A mask don't protect you. Plexiglass probably makes everything worse, and so on. Well, the problem was that I didn't get one single answer from one single reporter.
And may I tell you why? I mean, I may appear to be satirical and joking and exaggerating, but I'm really not. I mean, sometimes I am, but I'm going to be flat honest with you. You were ruining their plausible deniability, Jeffrey. You were informing them of things that once known would make them have to wittingly lie rather than just take the word of experts. And so, the last thing a reporter or his boss wants to hear is that they're going to be told the truth about something that they have just been reporting on anyway, based on, high sources or government authorities or, whatever body like the WHO or, the NIAID or whatever the Fauci's group was called. I forget his department. The last thing they wanted to know was to find out they'd been wrong and to then have to go forward because they knew they couldn't report what you were telling them. But you were going to ruin it by making them, by being able to call up and say, but we told you differently. And now you don't have the excuse of ignorance anymore.
What ended up happening was, so none of these people showed up. So we had to pack it with like the gardener and, his second cousin or whatever. That's who showed up to the meeting. But, and I called up my friend John Tamney, who's a real clear Marcus, a good friend. So he came. And then David Zweig, David Zweig was a
Yes.
very, very impressive guy.
Yep.
Independent mind, right? Independent
Yep.
thinker, happens to be an independent journalist.
I have nothing but respect for David Zweig.
I do too.
Because he was someone who didn't need to become a truth teller. He was someone who was in that department of the media where he could go forward with confidence and advancement if he just went along, and yet he didn't. And that wins great respect from me.
He's a hero of the times. One other reporter came, and she was a stringer for the British Medical Journal, the BMJ. And she showed up fully masked, never really showed her face. So if she walked in now, I wouldn't recognize her, right? So I don't even know what she looked like. She sat over in the corner, like 16 feet of distance, from everybody else, and never said a word, showed up, never said a word, and left. So she was the spy.
Never said a word. Yeah, you said it. I didn't have to. Yeah, never said a word to you. To her debriefers, however, she probably added color. Well, not only are they trying to bring down the transatlantic consensus about public health, I saw a pamphlet on their desk saying they revered Nietzsche. I saw a copy of Beyond Good and Evil on their desk. So whatever. I mean but a spy is a good character in any discussion of the media, because all spies want to be reporters and all reporters want to be spies. Meaning, reporters love the idea, though they're supposed to be independent, they love the idea of currying favor with the bosses, the insiders, the secret administrators, the directorate, or whatever they call it in Le Carre novels, and spies wish that they could get an audience, that they didn't just have an audience of one who's the person they report to. And so when spies and reporters get together, which they did during COVID, let's just cut to the chase, because we now know that our intelligence agents knew the damn truth about where they knew a more truthful version of where the COVID had come from. And, and they were retailing it to reporters who really didn't have any ability to check. I mean, how the heck could they check anything about a lab in Wuhan, China, and so on, or bat caves or whatever, zoonotic. What was the animal they blamed on it? It blamed it on it was an animal.
The pangolin.
Yeah, the pangolin. To this day, I have to look up what a pangolin is.
Yeah, I don't know. Are they? What are they? Do they have?
Are they a winged creature?
I don't know. Maybe they are. They what's the animal that carries the baby in his pouch? There's this particular
name. A marsupial. Are they a marsupial?
Are they a marsupial? I don't think they're a marsupial.
All I know is that it was a word with great credibility. Pangolin. That sounds like something in China that would have a bad disease. Which an animal which I have no experience of. And did Richard Attenborough ever do a show about it? No. Well, maybe. It was like blaming the coelacanth, this fish that was discovered when I was a kid and was thought to, have survived from the most primordial oceans. But the pangolin and the bat, as I say, choosing the bat was also good. I mean, it was inherently scary. As we speak, there's a new version of Dracula out, right now. I mean, the bat, right? Could they have picked? I'm going like, could they have picked another animal quite so ominous? Is there one? I mean, there's a snake, but nobody is really that afraid of snakes. They think that they can stay away from them. Bats. Whoa. What I'm revealing here is that more than I'm a novelist, more than I'm a journalist, I'm a novelist. And I was able to see my own profession and my own place in the media, not just from the perspective of somebody who wanted to get somewhere in it, But if someone who is actually writing stories about characters and fictional situations and archetypal conflicts, and I started to see my profession and what I did and so on, and the American media in which I moved and had friends as a setting, as a in-group, as a set of isolated characters. The way Dickens saw the court system in Bleak House or something. And viewed from that perspective, it was a very curious institution indeed, but very powerful. And I guess I finally had to start learning to forgive the people who it fooled because they didn't have the experience I did. And I had been fooled too. I'd been fooled more than they. They just read the damn thing. I tried to make a career out of
it. So every day you open up the newspaper and there's another agenda. And it's obvious to me in a way. There's many things that are apparent to me now, 5 years later, that were invisible to me 5 years prior. The existence of the administrative state as, the sort of the real government, with many layers. I didn't know anything about that. I thought the government was, like politicians or something. I didn't really understand.
That's thinking that movies are made by the actors. Wait, it's a John Wayne movie. Didn't John Wayne decide everything he has to say in it and how he would be shot and so on? And, what the story would be? Politicians running things. That's like saying Susan Lucci writes all my children.
I mentioned this only because, the New York Times has got us all enraged against what they call autocracy. Now, I had to look up. So this word auto, you can attach it to a lot of different words. So that you've got autopilot, automatic, automobile. What other autos are there? And I guess it's from the Greek, and it means something like self-driven, or self. Or autobiography, right? So it's like here's a biography, except it's by me, so it's auto.
It's funny.
Would be like a government by one guy, and they're very exercised about this.
Well, part of the spell that the New York Times casts, part of its hypnotic level of operations, is to provide the middle class of America, and I like and love and revere the middle class of America, with aspirational words like pangolin and autocracy. They can't just say dictatorship, which is the old word. They have to give
tyrant or despot. Even that's a little fancy. Despot, I suppose.
Strong man. Jerk. They have to make you feel always, as you read the New York Times, that week by week, step by step, you're getting a little bit more sophisticated. And here's the autocracy tracker, which, remember, is very much like the COVID versions. They've introduced an autocracy tracker. It's sort of like the doomsday clock. It can move in units of units of autocratic likelihood or something. I read it and still didn't understand it. But when I read this story about this autocracy tracker that they've just introduced, I saw that there are 12 markers, just like there are 12 months, 12 signs of the zodiac. I mean, it's a hugely potent number. And hypnotically, now that Scott Adams has died, I feel it's my duty to his wonderful soul to bring forward what I think I understand from his podcasts to be a message about how you are being persuaded before you are being reasoned with. Right. And the method of persuasion is basically hypnotic. So there are 12 markers of autocracy. I mean, I don't think even Hannah Arendt knew this. They've gotten it down to 12. It was like the Continental Congress. They had a vote on, somebody said, I think there were 14 actually. And they said, no, we just can't fit those two in, we're already 2 over the number of commandments in the Hebrew Bible. I don't think America will accept more than 12. Jeffrey, how was the number of weeks to slow the spread? How many was it? Was it 15?
No,
or
well,
initially, 15 days?
Initially, it was, so somebody came up with something that they thought it was a clever alliteration. 14, yes.
No, it was 15, I think. I can't remember.
No, it was 14 days to flatten the curve. I think that was it.
To slow the spread.
To slow the spread, right? And they had to say they couldn't say fortnight because nobody knows that word, right? So they said,
and they couldn't say 2 weeks because everybody knows that 2 weeks is always a lie. Let's get together in 2 weeks, meaning I never want to see you again. Or I'll send the check in 2 weeks, meaning you're going to have to call me in a month. If they had said this will, just stay at home for 2 weeks, everybody like,
oh, come on.
Like either they mean don't do it or they mean you're never leaving your house again. Nobody believes 2 weeks. But getting back to the autocracy tracker and the number 12 and the layers of hypnotic suggestion that the media promotes, you start to realize if they're trying to get these convincing numbers and these fancy words like autocracy and so on into my head, what are they really trying to do? And what they're really trying to do is trigger conformity among people who would have big enough egos to hope that they're still being treated as thinking people. So you'll look at the 12 markers of autocracy and so on in the New York Times and still feel that you're not just a sub or a rube who's taking whatever they feed you. No, you're analyzing some complex stuff, and so that's one of the ways they get you. And it's a lot like the case numbers in COVID.
Well, it's like the curve, which is a very interesting thing because you had this
two-dimensional
graph. Yeah, here's the way. This is the bad thing that's going to happen if you do nothing. But if you do the right thing, then it's going to go like this. And so you had to look at it. You go, well, I don't know. Is this true? Let me examine this curve that's been presented to me. I'm going to stare at it a little while. But sure enough, that's right. If we do nothing, we're going to go all the way up here like that. And that's bad. But if we mitigate and comply, then we're going to go like that. Right. So this
but you see, that's once again a kind of scare tactic that involves and depends on ignorance of how things work. Because that's like saying, if you don't go on a diet, you'll get heavier every day. Every day you'll gain a pound until you weigh 738 pounds. There are actually no natural limiting factors on how bad stuff can get. And if you do nothing, shit, man. I mean, you'll weigh more than the planet. No, the curve, man. The curve goes to infinity and it keeps getting steeper. And so, but then they said it would flatten the curve. It would flatten the curve, which made everybody think back to like 8th grade when they got that confusing XY axis thing, introduced in math. And they went, yes, curves. I remember that. That's important. Is that algebra? What was that? And I remember, I don't want to make fun of it, but they sent home all the college students. Remember when they sent home all the college students? I happen to have 2 kids in college and 2 kids who are attending really expensive colleges without like a lot of financial aid. Okay. And when they come home early in the spring of 2020, and I've already paid for the whole thing and it's March and they're home.
Right.
I really have a special interest in finding out if this damn thing is real because I'm losing money at it. And my kids are home, not knowing what to do and with no preparation for how to entertain them. And, can they get summer jobs? No, because nobody can. Well, what am I supposed to do? It's back to having, anyway. I noticed that all of the college students had been prepared by their colleges to explain to their parents why they were home. in case you had some reactionary rancher dad who was like, those pussies. No, Dad, you don't understand. We all went to a seminar online on Zoom, and the college explained to us about the curve and so on, and us being here is flattening it. And I mean, I had this conversation with my own kids and so on.
Yeah, I remember this is true. On March 16th, Deborah Burks actually delivered a special message to the youth of America to explain the urgency of compliance to their parents.
Yep. Oh, wow. I didn't know that. But, I was like, oh, here comes the big generational wedge that they're putting in, because now I'm just the blind old dad who wants to get his money's worth from college education that I'm paying for. And they're the, new progressive, enlightened, sciencey kids who are doing the right thing. And that's how they had every right to feel, because they trusted their teachers and their professors and their system and their media. And I looked at them like a younger version of myself and went, it's going to be rough for you when you find out those people aren't who you think. Or maybe you never will, bless your hearts, because it'll be much easier in some ways.
And then every day after that became exactly like Camus describes in The Plague, like the strange, immobile history. Like history kept turning back on itself every day. It was like every previous day, you lose track of time. Even now, I don't think people have regained their sense of time. I got a call yesterday where somebody I know very well, they were mixed up 2014 and 2013. I mean, just like really important days. I couldn't remember what was what.
So I have the particular problem that I was writing a book, and had just started a book in 2020 about something that had happened the year before. 3 months into 2020, we were so far from the year before and the world of the year before and the sensibilities of the year before that it may as well have been a book about the 19th century. So then, as time passed, and as you described, it didn't seem to pass in the same way. Have you ever had a clock whose battery is running out? A digital clock? Like I have a wall clock. When the battery runs out, it goes, the second hand goes, and then goes back. It never advances. It never goes around. And it was as though they put us all on a submarine. I mean, a submarine where you're down away from light and dark under the ocean, and they just have to tell you every day it's morning. And if you get sick and maybe take sleeping pills or in the dispensary for a while, you lose track of it and you never regain it. And sometimes I think about 2021 and I go, it either happened when I was a teenager, or it's still kind of happening. I can't decide.
Can't figure it out. I was your image submarine is great. Another image maybe might be the opium den.
Yes.
You remember in the picture of Dorian Gray? Dorian Gray goes into the opium den and stays there an uncertain amount of time, and then comes out again, and then bumps into somebody who he thinks he might be the bad guy who killed Sybil Vane and so on. And he shows him his face. No, I can't be right. Look how young I am. But the thing that's always puzzled me is how long was Dorian Gray at the opium den? I mean, were we talking about like a day, a week, a year? Like
Did we get the answer in the book? I forget.
No. It's always left vague. You don't really know.
Well, I mean, this sounds like a digression, but it's not. I have a friend, the novelist James Ellroy. He's a great, hardened, hard-boiled noir writer of sort of detective fiction originally, but finally stories about, American history, and especially post-war history, that are sprawling and magisterial, but also very laconic. Anyway, he told me once, he lives in LA, and he's been around cops and underworld characters all his life. And he said, we were talking about someone who'd committed a crime, and he said, that person wants to go to prison. And I said, what? He said, oh, lots of people who are criminals commit crimes that they know they'll be caught at so they can go to prison. They are tired of making their own decisions. He's like, in prison, you don't have to make decisions anymore. You just wake up and the guard tells you where to go, or you follow the routine, or and I remember thinking of that comment, and it was profoundly psychologically true. I felt after I had thought about it and after I had sort of tested it. And I thought that during COVID, it was kind of like that. The reason they got so much buy-in was that an anxious America that has choice all the time and can't figure out what the right choice is, or how to proceed and how to navigate, suddenly had everything decided for them. You're not allowed to go to the airport or to school. You have to wear this mask. You can live in your PJs all day, and it will be like everybody goes to a very soft prison, except for the people who still have to work and bring you meals in your prison and so on. It's harder for them, but we'll call them essential workers and butter them up and talk about how brave they are while they
clap for them.
Right. Well, they bring you your Kung Pao chicken on their bicycles, and you don't tip them because, I've written a script about the COVID period, and one of the details in it is how poorly one of the sort of spies or censors who work secretly on a college campus, moderating and modulating social media, how badly she treats the delivery people who bring her Thai food, because she doesn't touch cash. Don't you know there's a pandemic? The kid just sits there. And I really felt that was another aspect of it that was so strange. America, which supposedly is this egalitarian place where we love the underdog and so on, just treated this servant class like crap while it sat on its Zoom calls and they rode around on their bikes delivering its Thai iced teas.
And the New York Times telling its readers to get their food delivered,
right?
Whom they never mentioned. Presumably not readers of the New York Times. But you know what, Walter? This is another. I've learned so much. I didn't know the class was that much of a relevant desiderata to understand American life. I did not know that. I didn't know that until COVID.
Well, the thing is, class is one of our dirty little secrets, and we're not talking about it in the Marxist sense necessarily. We're not talking about the proletariat versus the bourgeois versus the petty bourgeois, etc. We're just talking about people who have to work and have to work at a certain place and show up at a certain time, and people who don't, and people who can, digitally work from anywhere and, whatever. And not all of the people who can digitally work from anywhere are all that well paid. And some people who have to show up, like plumbers, actually can charge a lot. But when it finally came down to it, you did see a major and rough and rather yawning distinction between the people who actually look at the watch ads on the second page of the New York Times, and aspire to buy the Rolex at Tourneau, and the people who don't know that there are watch ads on the second page of the New York Times because they just, see it on doorsteps or at newsstands while they deliver things on bikes.
Yeah, and it seemed to be the driving force for the shaping of the public mind, for the formation of public policy, for what you were allowed to say, what you should or shouldn't believe about everything. And it seems like a rather important element of the story to have overlooked, because I don't think that class suddenly became a relevant consideration in in American life in the spring of 2020, right? So it had to have been there much earlier.
Oh yeah. It just allowed us not to be quite so, willfully blind to its presence in our lives and to the prominence of that feature of life, which we pretend in America to have somehow surmounted or gotten around.
We always pretend that. And this is unlike the Commonwealth, where everybody recognizes that class distinctions are all around us. You can tell by the accents, you can tell by your family heritage. But in America, we pretend not to think about the subject at all.
Well, and I think part of the COVID legacy, unfortunately, is that we've become a far more class-bound society. I mean, we see Scott Bessent and others in the Trump administration really quite deliberately telling us that the rich got richer and they're going to try to rearrange the economics of the situation so that we can have a middle class again, and maybe they can have homes again, and so on. The Marxists don't think their methods work. They only think one thing works. But, I think they're acknowledging, and I think Trump's second win was proof of it, that things got really, really unfair in a kind of brutal way during COVID. And we have not turned the clock back on that particular degradation of our.
Well, before I let you go, let's talk quickly about your movie, which is called The Rash. There's an article on Brownstone where we are on it. We've got the script written. We've got a bit of a trailer. We're in this sort of this stage where we're trying to figure out what the next step is. Brownstone's serving as a fiscal sponsor because it's so in keeping with.
It's not a movie about COVID.
Nope.
In particular, just as those Twilight Zone episodes about, a spaceman landing in a quiet middle-class neighborhood weren't really about spacemen landing there. They were about paranoia and herd instincts and, racism sometimes. Allegory, the method by which we convert a specific situation into a universal situation and then also convert it back into a fictional specific situation, is the mode of this movie. Satire is the tone. It's a movie that I think combines some of the optimism of a Frank Capra movie like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, because in The Rash, where society breaks down around a skin affliction that no one can decide they can't decide if it's serious. Is it brought on by scratching, or is scratching a symptom of it? Nobody can tell. Did the scratching? It's like the chicken. Did this itch come first or the rash? But once the itch breaks out, and once you see scratching, just as once you see masks, and once you see, closed for the month on a cinema or a bar, it gets very real. Well, once everybody starts scratching, there's a rash, one way or another. And so I use this method to take and generalize and universalize and satirize, and I think kind of also particularize the COVID thing, because I wanted us to see that what we went through is a process of sort of, I would call it guided hysteria. And we could go through it again, but we could do it consciously this time in the movie. We never knew what was coming next during COVID. But in a movie, in Dr. Strangelove, let's say, a great satire of nuclear strategy and war fever, you know that the missiles on the big Situation Room screen or the planes that are getting closer to Russia, they're not just going to turn back in, 30 minutes in. You have a sense of process and inevitability in drama. You know that everything's going to get as bad as it possibly can get, and then it's going to get worse, and then it's going to get even worse, and then something is going to happen, and you're not sure what, but you're waiting the whole movie for that, and meantime you're enjoying your characters. And it was a movie that was based in some degree on research that I did with scientists, like one of the signers of the Great Barrington Declaration, Jay Bhattacharya, who I believe must have felt during that time, at first, like they were helping everybody. I'm going to write an article in the Wall Street Journal that says that you don't have to be quite as afraid of COVID as they're making you. I'm going to do a great service to America. Oh, next day, I'm being hated for that. I'm being reviled for that. I'm being shunned for that. What did I do wrong? And then next part, wow, I didn't really understand how my university, how my world, how my society worked. And am I just going to get depressed and fall apart and alienated? Or is there something that I can do to move past this disillusionment, to take this awakening, this dark awakening, and turn it to good? And, in Capra, that's always what happens. That's what happens to George, and it's what happens in It's a Wonderful Life, and so on. But it is the American dilemma. How does a free person and a thinker and an individual who's autonomous, one of the reasons the word autocracy bothers me is that it's also supposed to kind of put a little dark shadow on the idea of autonomy. Like, doing it for yourself? You mean like you do your own research? We do your research. Are you an autodidact? Are you one of those? Autodidacts for autocracy. No. You're not consensus based. What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
I bet you want out of the United Nations too. But anyway, in this movie, I decided that because it's a big theme, it's a big experience that we all had together, but we all had it together in real life, and we're not getting a chance to have it together in dream life, in art life. And until we do, I don't think we will have learned, advanced, settled our souls, or become healthy again. It will still be afflicting us until we process it in the way that humans know. Just like you process a dangerous hunt back in the Neolithic period by finally drawing on your cave wall a picture of the buffalo charging a man with a spear. You have not processed these mass experiences until you have externalized them as art in some way, externalized them as fables, and witnessed them rather than just endured them.
Walter, I have one final question for you before I let you go, and I'm just going to confess that I love the movie Up in the Air. I loved it.
Oh, good.
I think it's just great. But I understand that the book is much better.
Well, you understand correctly, which is good. Okay. So no need to read it and disillusion yourself, Jeffrey. But
I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it on your. Do you think I should? I'm going to. I think after this podcast, I'm going to download it and start reading.
And you will find that Up in the Air is in many ways predictive of some of the things that we've been discussing, because it was not just a movie about a guy who was addicted to frequent flyer miles and corporate hatchet men who fired people for a living and had no soul, and whose favorite restaurants were the most soulless type restaurants we offer, but it was a book about technology. And I won't tell you how it ends, but in the book, this is written in 2001. Remember, the iPhone came out in 2009, 2008? Well, I invented, for purposes of the book, and we did have the Palm Pilot and some other things at that time that were sort of, predictive of the iPhone. But I came up with something called the Handstar personal assistant. And in the book, as this lonely person, always on the move in these, what we might call sterile environments, proceeds through his adventures, we realize he will be alone with that thing at the end. And it was really a book about existentialism, technology, and the mobility that convinces us we're going somewhere when in fact, like you said with COVID, we're just going in circles. And can a Hollywood movie handle all that stuff? And it can and it shouldn't. It can and it shouldn't. It should have attractive, charismatic people drawing you into something like that, but that's not the job of the movies. They are not finely complex intellectual endeavors. They are experiences that use that use charisma and music and all these other things to get us together in a room, in a psychological, in a emotional room. And I thought the movie was great, even though I, of course, prefer the book. I love the movie. And I thought that George Clooney, he told me something that movie fans will appreciate. We were on the set as the movie was being filmed. And if you remember the movie, he does not get the girl. And he told me, he said, this is the first movie where George Clooney, and he meant himself in the third person, doesn't get the girl. He said, it's like Gary Cooper losing a gunfight. And he was quite aware that he was making a movie that would undermine his own, infallible, dapper, Cary Grant-like, savoir-faire. And I thought, wow, that's an insight into the movies that I never understood. The big actors know who they are in the public mind. And they also know at what point they have to take a dramatic turn with their meta character. And Clooney took this role because he realizes that a lonely businessman who doesn't get the girl is, in the history of George Clooney roles, a real turn. And he wanted to open up his own career. Great movie.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Well, I love the movie. I think I'm going to love the book more. And I'm looking forward to The Rash. Let's get it done. And thank you so much for spending all this time with me today, Walter. I appreciate it so much.
I could do it for hours, as is obvious to everyone by now. Okay.
We'll be in touch. Thank you, sir.